So the other day we were sitting down and trying to think of something that we'd like to do, namely a board build.
Yeah, building a giant board, and we were kind of tossing up between Blood Gulch from Halo, let us know if you want to see that, or doing a awesome display board for a space game. And then we all said simultaneously, Battlefleet Gothic.
Which doesn't exist anymore. But it kind of does.
So today we're going to look into the history of Battlefleet Gothic, and we're all going to paint up a ship as well, which is super exciting. So let's do it.
Flagships! I'm doing chaos. Who would have thought? Ha!
It's tabletop time.
Max headroom.
So,
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of me as I trolled the internet and the Wayback Machine to find out everything I could about Battlefleet Gothic. This extremely iconic game that set the tone of so much of the Warhammer history came out in 1999. Or did it? Because there's a lot about Battlefleet Gothic that you maybe don't know. So when I initially started looking up Battlefleet Gothic, I searched out some old White Dwarf articles, and that led me back in time, back to 1989, the true inception of Battlefleet Gothic. This first article is really interesting in that it does very specifically name the game Battlefleet Gothic. It talks about the fact that they're conceptualizing it, and at the bottom of the article, it even has a mocked up ship that looks like some kind of Eldar galleon. I'm not sure if this is a prototype or if it ever came out in the game, but it does appear that they were quite along a development cycle for Battlefleet Gothic. There is some amazing concept art by Jess Goodwin here, and we can see some designs and design language that still carries through to modern 40K. However, in this art, you can also see the trappings of the 80s. There's a lot of imagery that feels a little bit more Flash Gordon, Alien, and Return of the Jedi. Yeah, it's kind of got a lot of that classic 80s Rogue Trader era where there's a little bit of everything mixed in there. In this article, they talk about the fact that this is going to be the first big all Warhammer 40K game to come out, kind of an expansion for the Warhammer 40K universe, and they're really proud of it. They're talking it up, they're gonna make something. And after this article, nothing. There's complete silence. That is the last thing we would hear about Battlefleet Gothic for many years. Because it wasn't until July of 1991, 2 years later, that we would next hear anything about this massive full expansion for the Warhammer 40K universe that was supposedly Battlefleet Gothic. We didn't get Battlefleet Gothic. We got Space Fleet. Now, this might be one of those bookend games that a lot of people actually don't know anything about. You see, it was a fairly small release game and it didn't last a very long time. And the purpose of the game was to create a spaceship fleet battle simulator, but keep it super inclusive and really let it be your first game in the universe. You gotta remember, this era of Warhammer, there were lots of charts and rolling on things, and it was still a bit of a blend of a role-playing game and a tabletop war game. So they created Space Fleet to be something that an 8-year-old could play. It's really stripped down and simplified in the core box that introduces you to Imperial battleships, such as the Gothic class battlecruiser, interesting that, and you're fighting against the Eldar in their Wraith ships, although neither of them have separate rules in the original box. Over the next few months, Space Fleet would go on to be expanded in White Dwarfs to include a whole bunch of advanced rules, which feels much more similar to what Battlefleet Gothic would go on to become many years later. There are rules for boarding actions added, there are rules for differentiating the Imperial fleet from the Eldar fleet, as well as hit locations, maneuvers, etc. Also of note here is in the initial box, you really don't see anything that is reminiscent of Warhammer 40K at all. The battleships, to me, look like an electric guitar with Camelot on the back of it, and they're really not evoking much in the way of Gothic or that grimdark aesthetic we're used to at all. They're a lot more never-ending story, magical fantasy city combined with a battlecruiser, and the pirate galleon vibe of the Eldar ship is really interesting too. And in the ships that got added, there are certainly a few that are reminiscent of the Imperial designs to come, but there are a bunch of others that look really generic sci-fi, and the white paint schemes really add to that lingering 80s fantasy and sci-fi aesthetic that Space Fleet is definitely marred in. Now, despite the massive differences in terms of the ship design and a pivot in the name, perhaps because Star Trek, Star Wars, and sci-fi were so popular in this era, they thought Space Fleet was really simple and easily accessible. I certainly don't know the answer to that, and it's not something you can glean from reading White Dwarf articles. But what I did think was super interesting about this game is it is clear that it foundationally establishes pretty much everything we know about Warhammer 40K today. Black ships, the Astra Telepathica, Navis Nobilita, planetary governors, the entire way sectors and subsectors are broken up, the segmentums, the battle fleets, all of this is established in Space Fleet. The art here is super charming, and if you can find these copies of White Dwarf, I'd encourage you to go and have a look. It's so cool. There's so many obvious knockoffs in here, like we literally have the pilot's seat from Alien as some kind of navigating thing, and a bunch of Imperial officers looking out of Palpatine's window. Overall, my only guess is that the game did not sell very well, because after a mere 6 months, the game is never mentioned in White Dwarf ever again as a produced product. But not Battlefleet Gothic done, because we fast forward a few years indeed as we move on to 1998, where that original White Dwarf article I found can be located. Yes, written by Andy Chambers, the designer of Battlefleet Gothic, there is this wonderful article where he shares in White Dwarf the full playtest rules for a space battles game that he's really excited to be working on. Now, what's really interesting about this article is it's presented as if they've bullied a game designer to come out of the woodworks and share some like harebrained prototype, but it's quite evident Games Workshop have put a huge amount of work into this. The mocked up ships that they happen to have cast are eerily reminiscent of fully designed and created Battlefleet Gothic miniatures. And in fact, in this particular article, you can mail a postcard to Games Workshop, basically answering a trivia question to win the ships that were playtested with. It was truly a different era of Games Workshop. But this article goes through Andy's drive to basically re-pick up the dregs of these old Battlefleet Gothic ideas and create a ship game for Games Workshop, a space combat game. The vibe of that genuine behind the scenes share loses a bit of its luster when only 7 months later the official box set for Battlefleet Gothic launches, which tells me, knowing production pipelines, that they probably already had it ready to go about the time that article was published. So here we are in 1999 and we have the official launch of Battlefleet Gothic. The game was released as a 2-player starter set, Chaos versus Imperials, and it's here that we see all the designs that have become iconic today. Many of you will know them from the background art in your codexes. Many of you will also know them from ships from Battlefleet Gothic Armada, the video games. But now these ship designs have become ubiquitous. You can see the heritage in Space Fleet in a few of the designs, in particular the Imperial capital ships. However, for the most part, everything is completely redesigned for Battlefleet Gothic. The game launches with a charming battle report going through all the maneuvers of the Chaos and Imperial fleets. And as was the tradition at the time, the box had already released when the White Dwarf article came out, and the White Dwarf article is basically immediately advertising all the add-on ships you can get. For a brief moment, I was reminiscing about how cheap it was to collect Warhammer back then, but I noted how expensive Battlefleet Gothic was. The core box seemed really cheap, but the battle cruisers themselves were like $32 US, which doesn't sound like much today, but this is 1999. Adjusted for inflation is $63 US today. And that's for one ship. So I have a feeling that Battlefleet Gothic might have actually just been really expensive, and that's maybe why it didn't do so well. But either way, I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you actually lived that. It was a little bit before I was collecting. From there, and over the next few years, Battlefleet Gothic would receive an annual update. This update would add new rules, new types of fleets, and new factions, ultimately bringing 8 additional factions into the game. A game that started with Space Marines versus Chaos, and then the Eldar and Dark Eldar themselves as individual factions. We got the Mechanicus as their own version of the Imperial fleet with a couple of custom ships, as well as Space Marine fleets. We also ended up getting those Tyranids, Necrons, and Tau, the Tau of course coming out coinciding with their actual release as a faction, and the game continued to be supported basically through to that stage. From around the mid-thousands onwards, support for the game waned, and slowly but surely a trickle of products went out of stock until eventually the final sale call in 2013, which honestly was a lot later than I thought. I thought Battlefleet Gothic was defunct in like 2004 onwards. So that probably tells you how little store presence it had in Australia on shelves. In service of my journey, once we left the White Dwarf era, I wanted to really take a look at what it was like back in the day as someone who could look at Battlefleet Gothic. So I used the Wayback Machine. I went back to the original Games Workshop websites for the US store, the Forge World store, and I had a look at some of the articles available. It's a lot of fun if you've got some time and want to dive into the history, and you can see a different company. Yeah, they're not up with the tech, but they have designer commentary articles saying thank you to the fans, art signatures credited on everything, free wallpapers that you can still download today in their native resolution of like 1000 by 600 pixels. It's all there and it's amazing. I absolutely love it. And look, it might just be nostalgia biting, but take me back. Take me back to a time before the enshittification began. So from its humble roots as a White Dwarf promised through to Free Rules, the Space Fleet game, and ultimately Battlefleet Gothic, this was clearly a dream of Games Workshop's to create a Space Fleet combat game. Many people in the original company wanted this to happen as multiple iterations came through before we got the final game. However, it is interesting that this property, while still available in video game form, is possibly the most well-known Games Workshop game that is still abandoned. And while Aeronautica is abandoned again, Battlefleet Gothic has yet to get the reboot treatment. I think if they ever did reboot it, they would probably do it in that Horus Heresy vein where they can get away with just doing Imperium versus Chaos. And I think everyone would hate that, as they did with Epic being turned into Imperialis. As I mentioned earlier, Battlefleet Gothic literally established a huge percentage of the foundational lore that is 40k because it forced Games Workshop to look outside the small-scale planetary conflicts and start thinking about how the galaxy is held together. Government structures, fleet navigation, time dilation, areas like the Eye of Terror were fleshed out and made real through Battlefleet Gothic, and I do so fondly cherish times in the early thousands where global campaigns would include the results of Battlefleet Gothic tournaments being combined with Warhammer 40k tournaments, and it all just felt so seamless and good. So that's our dive into the history of Battlefleet Gothic. Hopefully you found it enjoyable, and I really encourage you to take a look through those old White Dwarfs. You can find all this stuff online. But with that said, we need to give it a crack. So for our part, we bought some STLs and downloaded them, and Murray, Jen, and I are each going to paint up a cool ship to get the idea of starting a fleet for Battlefleet Gothic. So when it came time for me to paint, I decided to go with a Chaos Despoiler battleship. Why Chaos? Is it because you paint Alpha Legion, Dave? Yeah, well, partly that. I love Chaos. But beyond that, it's also because Chaos was that starting faction. They've been there from the very beginning, well, at least of the official Battlefleet Gothic release. So before I could paint my model, I needed to print it, and here we confront one of the mixed issues with Battlefleet Gothic. It's no longer supported by Games Workshop. The official models are prohibitively expensive. I'm talking hundreds of dollars for single ships, especially capital ships, which means it's lovingly supported by a bunch of fans, and you can find 3D models of the ships all over the place, some for free, some for a few dollars, and some in between. I'm always nervous opening up a printer. We usually have pretty tight timelines, so like if this didn't work, it'll throw out our whole schedule for the week, and I don't know how well they printed. That's immediately promising. So we'll take a look. Ugh. Yeah, yours looks really good. Mine, there's some concerns that I already had, which was like the parts where I sliced it would be a bit thin, but they've actually printed. So we'll see. This might turn out really well. Hell yeah. Okay, there's gonna be a lot of supports to clean off, and let's get down to business. Defeat some Huns. Yeah. Let's get down to business to defeat Murray's puns. All right, and now that I have these gloves on, I can't really do anything for 3 minutes. That was not meant to happen. Why did the door just open? Ultimately, I split it into 3 sections, and this was really to allow the turret details and all of those hanging aerials, the Cloud City spires on the bottom of the ship, to survive as best as possible. Now, overall, after the print was done, this had worked pretty well, but we still lost some components. As I said, this was not really optimized for 3D printing, so there were some areas that were just ridiculously thin that peeled away when I was removing supports, namely the aerials on the side. However, with the ship glued together, the peril of splitting it into sections showed its head, which was that I needed to milliput a little gap around the side. Now, with a ship of this scale, it's fantastic. You don't need to be particularly delicate with this, as any texture that gets added by the milliput is just texture on a giant battleship. It really isn't a problem. And it didn't take too long to get this all together, and it looks pretty cool. I just don't know where I'm going to hold it. Now, as for painting my battleship, well, yes, of course I'm going to paint it Alpha Legion, but I know you're sick of watching me paint the same color scheme, so of course I'm going to do something different. Alpha Legion ships are often clandestine and strange and secretive, so I decided to go for a full black paint scheme with just a few panels paying an homage to my Alpha Legion. This despoiler battleship will be a strike cruiser and carry many of my Task Force Katos soldiers into battle. I've decided to name the vessel Charon's Toll after the ancient Greek ferry master of myth, which I think is super evocative and really fits the naming conventions of my Alpha Legion, but also the idea of this ferry master that can go places most ships cannot. I do pick out all the gun barrels and some electrical gubbins and paint all of these big windows with my glowy orange vibe to make it look nice and evil, as well as put some airbrush down the engine engine block to give it a bit of a thrust ignition there. For a nice spot detail, I decided to do it the ferry master himself, rowing his gondola through space, and on the other side, the pier, the other side of the river Styx, where he would arrive. I think this is a nice little touch, even if in real life, this would be like a 400-meter tall artwork. Overall, I think the despoiler ship looks pretty great, although, I don't know. I don't know that the black color scheme really works for me. I always lean towards black and then remember I like vivid, bright colors, but perhaps on a battle board, this kind of grungy, realistic void warship will look right at home. Now, when it came to bases for our models, I went for some lovely gaming bases that I found online, but the one thing they were missing was a flight stand. You see these models being not designed particularly well for playing on a table. They don't have anywhere to attach a flight stand, at least on Jen and my models. So I went into Blender and basically created some very sturdy, or at least more sturdy than standard flight stands, with big attachments that sort of fit the geometry of the model, using booleans and tools to effectively just create these. They were pretty simple to make, but they are bespoke to these particular ships. So the downside to this is if we do more ships for Battlefleet Gothic, I'll need to make more flight stands. It's not very complicated though, so I'm fine with it. We printed these in transparent resin, which is not nearly as good as clear acrylic rod, but it still gets the job done and hopefully will fit our ships nicely. All right, so the moment of truth is, have my little flight stands actually worked? And I think the answer is gonna be maybe. Or like a glove. And look at that center of balance too. The center of gravity is pretty good. Like
I did it.
I haven't glued it yet. So like, there you go. Hell yeah. Man, on the stand, now it looks 10 times cooler.
I agree.
Well, let's hope Marius and Jen works.
So now it's my turn to pick which faction I'm going to make my fleet for and paint it up as well. Looking at all my options, I decided to go for the classic Eldar. Now, when I think of Battlefleet Gothic, I think of how retro it is, and I'd done a piece previously that was using the retro Eldar into a cool little diorama. So I kind of wanted to keep in theme and use a really classic Eldar scheme, the Iodin. And if you can't tell already, I'm super excited to pick this faction and to paint up this Eldar Wraith ship. Printing this particular ship was really easy. It came in a couple of parts, which I glued together really simply, and it looked great. So there weren't any massive dramas there, and everything came together nicely, and I could get started right away. The Iodin paint scheme is a bright yellow as well as a deep blue. And for those that have painted yellow before, you'll probably know where I'm going to go with this. I knew off the bat not to paint yellow straight onto this model, to paint pink on first. And oh my God, it helped, but the amount of yellow I had to paint onto this thing was ridiculous. I think I did about 6 coats in the end, and it still came out super patchy. I think this was because I picked a way too bright yellow. I should have picked something that's a little bit not so saturated maybe, I don't know, but the point is I was already in the thick of it by the time it was too late to turn back. But that's totally fine because I knew I'd be putting a wash on majority of my work anyway, so it all came together in the end. The other thing to note is that in this project, as excited as I was, I kind of got a little bit lost in the sauce. You know when you're painting something and you kind of think it's one color and then you look back at your reference and go, oh no, it was actually brown, or it was actually this color instead. Guess what happened to me? I thought the blue was a teal color for some reason, and it turns out it's actually a deep blue. But this is fine. I just went over the top with a Citadel wash and deepened everything down to that nice deep blue. And because my day just couldn't end any better, I of course spilt that blue wash all over the paint table and myself. Great way to end the project, but I don't care. I'm still super happy with how my ship turned out, and I'm also really excited to paint more of these. I'll come up with a different method, I think, for painting on that yellow, maybe airbrushing it on so I don't have to do so many coats of yellow. But nonetheless, I love the retro vibe and feel of this ship, and I'm super excited to see it on the battlefield. With all that said and done, let's head over to Murray and see which faction he's picked for his Battlefleet Gothic fleet.
For my spaceship, I decided to go for the Imperium. They're just so iconic. When you think of 40k and spaceships, you immediately think of those huge snowplow, shovel-faced spaceships. Stupidly big, they have all the guns, plus some more guns, and they shoot everything. 40k in a nutshell as a spaceship. So of course, I was gonna pick that to paint. Dave did ask me if I wanted to build the battleship or the carrier, to which I replied halfway through the word carrier, battleship, because of course, I wanted all the big macro guns. And so I located files for this. Mine thoughtfully. It does seem to be built specifically for these sorts of war games, and thus is actually printed in multiple parts that's slotted together very nicely. Already +1 for Murray. Once it was assembled and ready to paint, there was no painting handle, nor did we have the flying stands. However, a wooden skewer did fit very snugly into the hole, so that became my lollipop holder to hold the ship as I sprayed it. And so Mario, what are you gonna do for this ship? What bombastic kind of color scheme are you gonna do? The box art, because it's John Blanche and it's so iconic, I can't not, it's so cool. So at first glance, it sort of looks like this entire ship is just gold with just the red prow, but it's actually almost ivory. First of all, very John Blanche. Ivory is like one of his 3 main colors in his life. It's amazing, but it is then accented with gold with the red prow. And so my 2 challenges here are to 1, try and emulate John Blanche and have a really cool ship, and 2, not to make the ivory too close to the gold. Sounds simple, but I just need to make sure that the ivory isn't too yellow. That's gonna be the trick. And so I'm gonna start with some browns and just work my way up using dry brushing, which I think this ship and all its designs will really accommodate dry brushing. And going through the painting steps, when it came to actually painting the front of the ship, that was definitely my favorite part, as I got to apply this really almost glaze-like red onto the front. Sort of captured all the dry brushing that I'd done, and it really had a nice texture underneath, and it's so vivid, it's really good. And it's time to do all the accents using actual metallics, all the golds and silvers, mostly picking out all the details to really help bring attention to parts of the ship and also to make your eye move along, and that's the biggest thing I want to do here. It's so long, it's actually ridiculously long, it's much bigger than I thought, so I used the gold to do basically lines across the guns. It's all about making your eye move down the hull of the ship. And then with some brown washes over the metal, it is done. This was actually really simple to put together for how effective it looks. I'm really happy with it. I think I captured that John Blanche-ness of it. It is honestly a bit darker than I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be more of a brighter ivory. I think I could have gone a bit harder with some of the dry brushing. However, if I went too far, again, I think I would have conflicted with the gold a bit. So all in all, I'm pretty happy with it. So I guess it's time to stick it on flight stand and see how it looks then. Reveals. That way or that way.
Look at that guy.
It's very dark.
I have already done a bypass through the warehouse making spaceship noises.
Yours looks so bright and cool, but they'll look great on a board together. Mine is evil and chaotic.
Perfectly camouflaged on your shirt.
Exactly. So yeah, how would you see this flying through the void? You wouldn't, and that's why it's genius. That was really cool. What do you think of spaceship painting?
I think it was great. I had so much fun. I loved doing a retro paint job, and I think it fit the theme really, really well, and I want to paint more.
Well, we're going to be doing a board build. It's going to be a diorama. We're going to really try and wow you in space, which is kind of a unique take on things.
The space of wow.
So stay tuned next week. If you like this, we're going to be trying this thing where we do little mini series. So we've talked about Battlefleet Gothic, and now we're going to make a cool thing.
Yeah, like the spaceship game genre. I feel so lackluster. Like there's a couple of games. So we thought, let's make something really cool that stands out.
Let's give it some love. So tune in next week, like, subscribe, do all those things, comment. It helps people actually see our videos, which is good.
The bell that you can hit.
And we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
That's, I was trying to do like the outro of Star Trek.
Can you beam us up? That would be great.
He won't.
Please.
Zero shot in these
dare
2
you.
days that he's going to beam us up.
I dare you to beam us up.
Vaughn, we're going to give you a clean shot of the background. Can you beam us out of here? Nothing says Warhammer 40K's Battlefleet Gothic like beaming me up to a Starfleet.
Into atoms.
To the Enterprise D, to Jean-Luc Picard, to Riker. Zero shot that happens.